Hey, Will King here, and today on the Build Show, we're talking superior walls, details surrounding it, how to plan for it, how to install it, and all the pros and cons of using this system for your next house. Let's take a look at it. All right, so behind me, you see a huge precast basement foundation. Now we're using superior walls, and there's actually a company in Tennessee called Warrior Precast, and that's who's here behind me today finishing up. But I want to show you up top first before we get down in the hole what this looks like. So like I said, it is precast, it's made in the factory. They actually bring all these wall panels in on 18-wheelers and they set them with a crane. Now you can see the crane behind me, and these guys actually didn't even get started setting the walls yesterday till around lunchtime or so. They had a little bit of trouble getting that big crane down the hill. But once they got set up, all these panels got set in half a day. So, and that's really the thing about superior walls and precast walls that I've really grown to love is just the speed of it. And not only that, the perfection of these walls. It's like anything else made in the factory. They're gonna be straight, they're gonna be true, and you know exactly what you're getting. But you can see behind me, this is actually the safe room that's gonna be underneath the front porch. Now today, they're actually gonna set a 2-foot skirt wall on top of these wall panels to get us above grade, so that way we have proper drainage away from the house. But that skirt wall is actually only going on the front of this house. Everything behind us is not getting it, and that's because the grade worked out that way. So I will say, with superior walls or precast walls like this one, you have to plan ahead. You can't wait till your foundation guys get on site and start setting panels to figure out your grade work. You have to put that work in early, but that work pays off big time. So one thing I commonly get asked about superior walls is how do you join a garage to the basement? You know, and I'm not really a fan of two different foundation types if I can avoid it. So if we were doing poured walls, I would obviously do a poured wall garage foundation and have a bulkhead here tying them together where they're locked. But with superior wall, it's a little bit more difficult. Now they do have a detail where we could have put superior walls for our garage foundation, our stem walls coming up to pour the slab into. But because of the way the garage ties into this elevation here, or into the topography, we're actually gonna have a retaining wall coming off of it and up the driveway. So what you see behind me is really my favorite way of joining both the precast foundation to a CMU foundation or block foundation for the garage slab. So with that, I like to have a short connection. So that's one thing, is that if you had say a 30-foot long wall or 24-foot long wall that join the garage, you're opening yourself up for more problems because you're gonna have all this weight of the garage pushing down on the soil that's gonna potentially impact that wall. So to set yourself up for more success, and I would tell you that a shorter wall with these nice shear walls behind it, if you will, even though that's the foundation wall or the exterior walls, but it's acting as a complete shear wall holding this panel. So when we tie them together, you avoid that issue. Now, I will say the footer that for the garage is gonna be about where I'm standing. Okay, so we're gonna dig that footer here, and that's gonna be your standard concrete footer. But in the overdig, so all this overdig right here will be filled with gravel, but to span the footer of the garage over to this wall to connect them, we're actually gonna use precast concrete beams, if you will, or big lintels that'll sit on top of the footer of the garage, and it'll sit on top of basically this big brick ledge that comes off the side of this wall. And that's how we span the overdig to make sure we don't have any settling. All right, let's talk about some exterior details of what these walls look like. So right here behind me is actually just our broom finish concrete. You can see it. It's a nice, even, a really good looking broom finish. In fact, I've been told by my rep that there's some people that even leave this as a finished surface and maybe even stain it in some cases. But I could see this being a decent look if you had your facade coming down or your siding and just barely covering the top of this wall. You could absolutely leave the broom finish as a nice final look. But what else is going on right here while we're on the outside of this wall down inside the hole? So what you're seeing right here is actually the brick ledge. So this house is gonna have a full brick facade, and they're gonna put these brick ledges in according to the elevations, of course. They put brick ties in already. You can see the brick ties already set into the wall panels too. But let's talk about what I'm standing on for a second. So this is just a nice 1/2-inch clean crushed stone footer. And some of the naysayers out there actually don't like the fact that these sit on a stone footer, but I'm kind of the opposite. I like the fact that it's sitting on a stone footer, because if you can imagine the path of water, which is what you always have to think about no matter what you're building, if water comes down inside this hole that we're standing in, obviously we're going to be backfilling all this area with gravel. There's gravel in this footer. There's gravel under the slab, and everything's pitched to the daylight side. So really, even if my drain pipe that's underneath me completely fails, there's a really good chance that all the water that gets down in here is going to have a nice path to drain to the daylight into this basement. But the continuous flow path for water to come down under your footer, under the slab, and out into your drain pipes, I think is a no-brainer. And really, by avoiding that concrete footer, you're not putting the hydrostatic pressure underneath that slab when water builds up, because any subsurface water or groundwater that was to come up, it has a path to get back out. Whereas in a traditional foundation with a poured concrete footer, it really traps it. They do have in their builder guidebook a chart that's going to tell you how thick the footer needs to be. But if you think about what the footer does, okay, so it's just to distribute the load of this wall, the bearing of this wall, into the soil below us. So if you look at their guidebook, it shows you the load pass about a 60-degree angle from this wall going down into the dirt. So the thicker the stone, the wider the distribution of that weight's going to be. So in that guidebook, they have a chart that's going to tell you, based off your house, based off your soil conditions, how tall or how thick to make that footer. But the good news is you don't have to do the footers. All you have to do is excavate the basement. These guys actually come in and they prep for their own walls. We provide the stone, but of course they're actually putting in their footers, compacting it to their specs, and getting it ready. And one thing I want to point out too is you have to set rebar stakes on the corners. So you can see out here on the corner of this wall the orange paint. So that's actually where the rebar stake came up yesterday morning before they covered it up. And that's how they make sure that the corners of these walls get set exactly where they're supposed to be. They send you the CAD file, your surveyor marks it, and I love the fact that it's perfectly square and it's set exactly where it needs to be. And I can tell you from experience, that's a little bit different than my experience I've had with some poured walls. These are not going to give you those same issues when it comes to things being out of square, out of plumb, and that kind of issue. All right, so real fast too, I want to point out that these walls are actually poured with 5,000 PSI concrete. And the reason that's important is because water can't penetrate 5,000 PSI concrete without any other additives to it. It's already a waterproof wall, which is a really neat setup because you actually don't have to add another waterproof membrane over this to still get their warranty. Now what they use at their joints, because this panel here behind me is about 14 feet long. It has an inside corner here, has a seam down there where the next panel joins. But they have their own proprietary sealant they've been using for a number of years that they use on the inside, the outside, and in between these panels to seal off the joints where these wall panels come together. But I will say a good belt and suspenders approach would be to go ahead and waterproof an additional layer on the outside of these walls. It may not be required. I think that the concrete, long term with the 5,000 PSI concrete, you're not really going to have an issue with that, especially if you have a nice drainage plan, even with just gravel backfill, so the pressure doesn't build up. But the one thing that I think adding the waterproof membrane around would do is just to ensure that over time you never have an issue where these joints come together. It's just one thing to point out. It's not required, but I think it's just a nice belt and suspenders approach. All right, so we came down into the basement to talk about the inside of the walls, but while we're down here, they're actually flying in this skirt wall you can see behind me. So you can see how they're gonna set this on top of the 9-foot wall. That's a 2-foot tall skirt that's gonna bolt in. That's actually gonna be where our floor system sits on that ledge that you're seeing. But while they're doing that, let's talk about this wall real fast. So on the inside, you can see that we're seeing a lot of blue styrofoam, and you can see that all over the basement. It's kind of a signature look, I feel like, now when you see Superior walls. But this is actually a 2.5-inch foam board. It's a R12.5, okay? And it's between each stud. So these studs are gonna be 24 inches on center. They're actually concrete studs. So you have this 1.75-inch panel, or the face of the concrete, that ties in to the studs. Now the overall thickness here is actually 10.25. But these studs are tied in to the face concrete, I guess you want to call that. But it is thermally broken, so they have more foam on the back side of the stud before this galvanized piece. It's going to give us, I guess, our nailer, or what we're going to screw our drywall to. But the studs are thermally broken. You can see here at the bottom, this is actually a tie. And so before we pour our slab, we're going to pull these ties down all the way around. That's going to lock the bottom of these walls into our poured slab, that's going to really tie in the bottom. So after the slab's poured, then we set our floor system on top, and then that's going to lock the top of the wall in, and then we can actually backfill. But if you pay attention to the top of that bond beam at the top of this wall, you can see it's pre-drilled, okay? And that's going to be for our anchor bolts when we put our treated top plate on. And then our floor system will go on top of that. All right, so I think to make this a fair video, we should also discuss some of the cons or the negatives of Superior walls or precast walls. And I'll speak to several things that I've been asked about, or some of the naysayers have pointed out to me. And I think the number one thing that we should talk about is the lead time of Superior walls or precast walls can sometimes be aggravating, because on the surface you may think, oh, it's going to save me so much time, but depending on schedules, depending on the demand, you may have to wait a little while to get your walls. So 4 to 6 weeks is not uncommon after you sign off on your drawings and they put it in the fabrication schedule, or put it into their fabrication schedule. You may wait 6 weeks to get your walls. But you have to compare that, I guess, to what the schedule would be if you had a poured wall system. Depending on that subcontractor and how backed up they are, it may be a wash. It may not actually be a negative having to wait 6 weeks. And I will say on that, if you're putting brick ledges on, sometimes that may slow you down a little bit more, because you can't measure for that until your excavation's complete. So the other thing that gets brought up to me all the time from the naysayers is that it's a stone foundation or a stone footer and it's not on concrete. Now, and I can see where that would really cause some concern if you weren't familiar with the system and didn't understand it. My experience, I've had no issues with the stone foundation or the stone footers under these walls, and I have confidence in it, but I can see where some people are going to be hung up on that and have a hard time accepting that they're not using a concrete footer in their house. But really, I think the biggest con, in my opinion, of using a precast wall like Superior Wall is really retaining walls. And a lot of times here on the lake, when we're building houses, we have to tie in several different retaining walls to our foundation or to our house. And although it is very possible to do it out of a different system and tie them in together, I really like the strength of having a big concrete footer underneath my retaining wall and that all be tied into my house foundation, depending on the situation, of course. But I think that's probably the one thing that you should be cautious about if you're planning a house with Superior Wall. So I hope you learned a little bit today about Superior Walls. I think between this video and some of my other ones we've done before, you can probably find all the details that you need. But go to their website. They're going to put you in contact with a distributor or an installer close to you, and they're going to have a rep that can give you all the information that you're looking for. If you're not already following us on Instagram, please go do so. It's @WillKingBuilds. And just remember, iron sharpens iron. So keep grinding, keep watching these videos, and we'll see you right here on The Build Show.